Thanks a lot for this opportunity. I appreciate the chance to speak with you all. And man, if we ever get to travel again, Dylan, I owe you a big old pitcher of beer, I think. I'm excited to come and speak again to some Nebraska folks about what we can get out of prescribed fire on rangelands, and here particularly thinking about private rangelands and those that are used actively for grazing. I think everybody is pretty familiar with patch burn grazing in general. We're going to hit a little bit of what I call patch burn grazing 1.0 and then transition to what I've been calling patch burn grazing 2.0, which is where we're particularly focused on the benefits of prescribed fire for the production of livestock. And I'm going to make the case for better forage quality, show you some data on this, better livestock performance, some evidence of drought resilience, and talk about nutrient cycling, particularly in the soils. We're all pretty familiar with how we think that the pre-European settlement landscapes looked in grasslands and rangelands worldwide. We think of this fire grazing interaction, also called pyrrhic herbivory, where there's these spatially discrete fires bounded to areas of the landscape by fire breaks that naturally occur. These areas have particularly high forage, and what the South Africans call a magnet effect brings grazing ungulates into that area where they focus their grazing there for that high quality forage. Meanwhile, there are other areas in the landscape that have lower quality forage that are being ignored by the animals. So those areas are able to grow up and have a lot of fuel in there if there's an ignition in there later. And in the meantime, they're providing a lot of habitat. So that creates this shifting mosaic as ignitions find fuel and grazers rotate through the landscape. We're pretty much contractually obligated to show this slide. You've probably seen this before, where you can see these discrete patch types, habitat types that occur on the landscape at the same time when you have these spatially discrete fires. And you can see here that we can think about these areas as being more prone to the habitat and niche requirements of particular grassland birds. We see this across all sorts of grassland biodiversity as well, not just birds. Maybe a more colorful way to look at this is to see how some of these photos from Tori Hovick at NDSU, where we see these birds that are specializing in these particular habitat types, then that spans this habitat gradient. So a lot of the patch burn grazing work, stuff I call Engeldorf stuff from Dave Engel and Sam Fullendorf, starting in the southern plains, a lot of that has focused on wildlife and this habitat diversity stuff, also using prescribed fire to control woody invaders and how that fits into creating a grassland or maintaining a grassland state in working pastures. Livestock production has really only been considered in a lot of the extant patch burn grazing work, and showing that, hey, it's all right to do this and that it won't reduce your cow gains. So you're not going to be losing anything if we do this patch burning stuff for the benefit of biodiversity conservation, for the benefit of the grassland state. This can be incorporated into livestock production and it won't hurt things. Something that's really come out of a lot of that research on patch burn grazing is an understanding of how essential heterogeneity is in rangeland environments and how we can internalize that in our management for it. So if you're not familiar with this chapter, I think this is a really good place to get started, a really good review of the literature. This chapter here, just Google the Brisky Rangeland book, and you can find this in there. Coming out of that, is it's clear that we need to distinguish between two types of heterogeneity in rangeland landscapes: that which is inherent in the landscape, driven by, say, soils or ecological sites, is illustrated here. This yellow line corresponds in both of these photos. We have the soil map on the left and a grazed pasture on the right. You can see some animals in there, and we're all just pretty resigned to the fact that there are just going to be some areas of a heterogeneous landscape that are going to be preferred by animals. These lowland areas are going to be wetter, they're going to be greener, and animals are just going to be drawn to them. And then, in a sense, with disturbance-driven heterogeneity, we are imposing a pattern on the landscape through our management. So here is a prescribed burn in prairie in North Dakota. And when we consider inherent and disturbance-driven heterogeneity, I like to think about it as squares versus squiggles. So when we're dividing up a pasture in North America, everything's pretty much just on a grid. It's on squares. So we divide our sections into pastures, and we divide our pastures into patches, and we're trying to fit these squares over top of this pretty heterogeneous landscape. And from a scientific side, sometimes we think like, oh, we got to control for all this variability, but I would argue that on a management side, we can use this variability to buffer against variability in production. So we can internalize this heterogeneity and make it part of our management scheme. And why a producer might care about this is that heterogeneity then begets stability in all sorts of products and processes that we want to see in a working landscape, which gives a lot more predictability to a producer, say, making their stocking decisions. So if we're looking ahead at a grazing season in April or May, and we're looking at how many animals we're going to put out there, how are we going to know whether that resource base is going to be there that we're going to need later in the season? And if we're able to stabilize and increase the predictability of those resources, and we're less reliant on needing to purchase inputs. So we already have some evidence that this diversity stability relationship is productive for livestock producers. These are some data out of the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve in Oklahoma. We show that as spatial heterogeneity increases, the variability in the amount of grazing forage resources, the variability in that from year to year decreases as we increase spatial heterogeneity. So we can think about this as a grass bank, you know, if that essentially that unburned area, it's sitting there, it's not ideal forage, but hey, animals can go right over there and start grazing that if they need to. We're not buying expensive hay. But really, this is just a drought mitigation strategy. What we've been thinking about in my lab up what started this work at North Dakota State University, now continuing it in Eastern Montana with the ARS, is there are actual direct benefits for livestock production, not just mitigation of disaster, but are there some positive things we can get from this? In a unique landscape where there's not a lot of, in the region where there's not a lot of prescribed firework in general, and we have these weird woolly white livestock, in addition to a lot of the cattle and bison work that's been done on patchburn grazing. So to test this patchburn grazing 2.0, we put together 2 field studies here over there in North Dakota, one in the central part of the state, one in a more arid area in the southwestern part of the state. And we're particularly focused on if we can use prescribed fire to improve forage quality, to improve the availability of soil nutrients, and get this done while protecting what would be called soil health by not reducing the quality of some important soil metrics. So a quick overview of how we did this. We can think about our sections. We take a 640 acre section. We can divide that up into 4 different pastures. And you can see here some of our fires on Google Earth, which is kind of cool. Here in the bottom left, you can see we have a 40 acre burn. And then on the right, we have a 20 acre burn. It just kind of matches to these 2 different spatial extents that we're playing around with burning here. We zoom in on that pasture with the 40 acre burn, and this is at the beginning of the experiment when we first initiated it. We have 1 patch there that's green, that's the recently burned area, and the rest of this we say is just, well, it just hasn't been burned yet. And in subsequent years, that patch will rotate around, and you can see all these fairly randomly distributed forage sampling points that the graduate students go to and clip. And we're doing this clipping monthly, which gives us really interesting insight into how forage resources change over the course of the season, which is pretty new for patchburn grazing work. A lot of times people in the published literature so far, someone just kind of went out and maybe made a clipping in the middle of the summer at peak biomass, just say, hey, we compare this, but we're really interested in describing what that forage resource is for the entirety of the season. And we're able to process all of these samples, and we're talking thousands of samples a summer because of collaboration with Marisol Berti and the Plant Sciences Department at NDSU, who has a near infrared spectroscopy machine. So we can just a very high throughput machine that can get us a lot of information on forage quality, not just crude protein content, all sorts of stuff about the forage composition on a lot of samples. And these are the backbone of the data that I'll be showing you here. So again, we have these two sites. In Streeter, we're comparing grazing systems. We have patch burn grazing, the 40-acre and the 20-acre burns. We're comparing those to season-long continuous grazing without fire, and comparing that also to a rotational grazing system. Mesic prairie, that mixed prairie that's a little wetter, invaded by Kentucky bluegrass. Out in Hettinger, we're specifically comparing cattle versus sheep, and 3 pastures each of those. Those are post-CRP fields, so we'll get into what the implications of that are later. But I have 2 great graduate students at Streeter. Megan Wanchuk is a master's student at Hettinger. Jonathan Spees is a PhD student who actually just started a job at Chadron State College. So if you want to know more about this in a Nebraska context, you all should reach out to him. So one thing I want to emphasize is that we started both of these studies in a drought year. You can see the deviation from normal precipitation here, and people are kind of like, "Oh, you're crazy! You're going to go out and set fire to this forage, and it's it's a dry year already in April and May." And what we were able to see is that even despite the fact that we started this in a drought year, we had pretty good cattle gains. In the central North Dakota here, our unburned pastures, at that point, we were just comparing it to the continuous grazing without fire. We had generally a negative, so cattle actually lost a little bit of weight over the course of the season, and on both of our patch burns with the 40-acre and the 20-acre, where we tried to burn another 20 in the summer, we actually had positive gains on that. So we had neutral to increased gains with our cattle on both locations. Sheep stabilized their gains despite a pretty significant drought. And of course, gains on cattle isn't your first metric for whether you have a good livestock production system or not. But Megan's actually been parsing the calf performance on old versus young cows, and is seeing some really interesting results on how the old cows that we would expect to not do so well, have lighter calves coming off, are actually benefiting from fire as well. So kind of stay tuned on that as she works through her thesis. That wasn't just a fluke in that first year. Yeah, you can see there that on this no fire side, that first year, our drought year, was the worst for cattle, but the variability is very wide going forward. So there's 4 years of data here. You can see we've added that rotational grazing system. They're looking at just around basically 0, holding steady over the course of the grazing season in terms of their weight, but we do see consistently animals on our burn pastures coming off with a little bit more weight going into the winter, which is just indicates that they're in good condition and they're ready for the winter. We attribute a lot of this primarily to the fact that the forage quality in burned areas is better, as we expected. So here, this is data that Jonathan published off that first year, that drought year, where the green is our most recently burned areas, and this orange-brown is our unburned. Haven't burned it yet. It's going to be burned in subsequent years. And especially in central North Dakota, where it's more rainfall, you really see a substantial contrast in the landscape on what the forage quality is here. So we see that the animals are using that. So it's not only that the forage quality is higher. Jonathan calculated this selection index, which is basically just saying that, when we're up here, we're seeing this preference for the most recently burned patches. And this is across all 4 years of his data collection, averaged out. And we just see every year cattle and sheep show this preference for those burned areas. We can do a little more analysis to see what they're really selecting for and even what they're avoiding. And so the first thing we can look at on this graph is we can see the different forage quality variables that we're able to get with that NIR analysis. So we're familiar often with crude protein content as being the go-to indicator of forage quality, but we're also able to calculate lignin, and then these 2 measures of fiber here. And when we put this in this multivariate space, we see the selection index here. Animals really are selecting for areas that are high in crude protein. Available biomass is just a measure of how much stuff is standing there, and they're selecting against high density forage because the shortest stuff is the most succulent and it is the highest quality. Now, we might have thought that we could use moisture as a proxy. So, if you don't have a $40,000 forage analyzer, could we just look at moisture? Because we generally expect that shorter stuff in the burned area to be higher moisture content. We actually saw that backing off in the season. So we see this orthogonal gradient on moisture. So we basically see earlier in the season is farther along on the right side of this moisture gradient, and then it moves towards the lignin side as the plants mature and become more stemmy. Megan put this graph together. It's a kind of a rough draft now, kind of busy, but what she's doing is looking at the proportion of the points that she's sampled in those patches. She's combined the nutrient requirements of a nursing cow for crude protein content as well as energy. She's combined those two and just said whether an individual point meets the needs of that animal in that month or not. And the big thing to look at here is here in the most recently burned patches, we're floating around 50% of the points are meeting what cows need at every month during the grazing season. If you look over here, the NF, these are the two treatments without fire. So our season-long continuous grazing and the rotational grazing. 1 month in 1 year, did any of those pastures exceed 50% of a patch or of a paddock providing what, or meeting the nutritional requirements of those animals? So when you go back and you look at see here, yeah, that those unburned areas out there, most of that landscape is not giving animals what they need, but we are consistently seeing a much higher proportion of points in burned areas providing the nutrient requirements for animals. And I think that really is what accounts for the better weight gains when they're coming off at the end of the season. Megan is much more of an animal science, has much more of an animal science focus. So she was also interested in mineral content. I did not expect to see this and said, yeah, fine, go analyze it. We'll see what happens. And she found consistently higher mineral content in the forage on the most recently burned patches. Now you can see some lines in here. So for on calcium, she gives 2 measures of what the nutritional requirements for animals are. And we're consistently meeting those both early and late in the season. In terms of calcium, you can see later in the season, we're not meeting phosphorus. Copper, we're never meeting the full dietary requirements of a grazing cow on copper, but you can see those burned areas are much higher. So a rancher isn't going to just stop buying mineral supplement for animals, but there is a pretty substantial gain in what they're going to need to provide. And we've seen this in Montana. It's been just kind of anecdotal at this point, but I've had some people come from the BLM and say, guys are saying they're just not using as much mineral supplement on areas that we burned this last spring. And I think it's really consistent with what Megan's showing here. So when we look down into the soils, this has been Jonathan has had more of an ecosystem perspective compared to Megan's animal science perspective. And it's important to remember that these pastures that he's working on went to CRP. They're former row crop. They went to CRP in the mid-'80s. And basically nothing has been done with them since. And there's been some grazing in a few years before we started this experiment. So if you look clear to the right on these graphs, that is not yet burned is stuff that's been pretty much just sitting around, has had some grazing, since the 80s or whatever. And you see that the total nitrogen and total carbon of those soils is quite low. And as soon as we put fire in to this system, we're getting substantially more nitrogen and carbon, as a measure of the total percentage of the soil. And that's kicked up, especially with carbon in the most recently burned areas. And then, that's maintained, but you see it declining with 3 years since fire. So we definitely have boosted nutrient cycling in these pastures, but just looking at total nitrogen doesn't tell us a lot about some of the mechanisms that might be driving our high forage quality. So in a separate study on some burns in a private landowner's pasture.
Down to just a few minutes, Devin.
Great, thank you. We looked at these short-term dynamics on the plant available mineralized nitrogen, we saw exactly what we expected to see. One day after the fire, we saw a spike in ammonium, and then we saw over time an increase in nitrate, which is exactly what we would expect as per the nitrogen cycle. We've been measuring the temperatures that we've gotten on these fires for quite a while. It's kind of a smash up of data here. On the left is from that previous study with the plant available nitrogen, where those pastures weren't grazed. And you can see that they're a lot hotter, both in the canopy and on the soil surface, than these other data that are comparing those two long-term patch burn grazing studies. So even though we've had some pretty high heating both in the canopy and at the soil surface, I put some of those data into a soil heating model, and shows that even though we have surface heating that's ranging from, you know, just right around 200 degrees Celsius to even above 400 degrees Celsius, all that heating is really limited to the top 1 or 2 centimeters. So, you know, heat goes up, and soil is a great insulator. So we have a lot of that heating that's just restricted to the very top of the soil surface. And as a consequence, we don't see the negative impacts to soil microbes that are seen in really extreme fire situations. We would expect a lot of fungi to be burned off, and we're really not seeing that compositional shift, that on the bottom there, but in general, you can see, comparing that not yet burned area that's been sitting around, you know, since the CRP days, we've really increased the overall amount of microbes in the soils, which have really good effects on nutrient cycling and just kind of soil health writ large. So how do we, you know, go forward with this as a sustainable management program, especially when we think about the shifts we've seen on those post-CRP pastures? Disturbance is just really important for conservation, below ground, above ground, birds, mammals, whatever. Without disturbance, we have functionality in that system dropping off, which is not good for producers, it's not good for conservation. To pull this off sustainably, we really need to think about the fire regime. So I think that spatially discrete fires, the spatial extent component of fire regime, is really important here. Having fire in the system every year, but occurring at spatially patchy areas, gives plenty of time for things to recover, for succession to go on, leaving refugia for recolonization, leaving the nesting habitat for henslow sparrows, and all that is really important. And we get that through spatially discrete fires and ensuring that we're not overstocked. So to summarize all this, I think we've shown that prescribed fire in this region, I think throughout the plains, we're complementing a lot of work in a more challenging landscape, I'd say. We have direct benefits for livestock production. Livestock are focusing in our burned areas, which have better forage. We have a negligible or a positive effect on soil and the metrics that go into soil health. And while we're at this, we can affect conservation on these production landscapes as well. So with that, if there's a few more minutes, I'd love to take some questions.